It's wonderful to be back. Not just to Marlborough, but to New Zealand. I first came here in 1974. I had shoulder-length hair. Came to South Island, hitchhiked around for 6 weeks, had a wonderful time, explored every one-lane bridge on two-lane roads that you have in South Island, which is a magnificent collection. And I was very impressed, by the way, in Blenheim, that you have a roundabout with a train track running through it, which is very, very impressive. I believe it's unique in the world, and I hope that you never lose it. I came a few days earlier because it's, of course, as some of you know, it's not the first time I've been to Marlborough. Been here multiple times, in fact. And I came down because I wanted to immerse myself once again in Sauvignon Blanc as it's grown and produced here, talked about here, thought about here. And I had a whole series of meetings with various producers set up. And essentially, I spent the last several days torturing New Zealand wine producers here in Marlborough. It was a classic example of Kiwi hospitality. I tortured them, they pretended to enjoy it. And it became clear, and it's clear to you, it's not any great insight on my part, that some of you may have heard me speak 3 years ago at the inaugural Sauvignon Blanc conference, and I had said, very presumptuously in my best Oprah Winfrey manner, that you were having a midlife crisis. You might like to know that you seem to be getting over that now. The therapy really seems to have helped, and most of you have sort of settled down into sort of kind of subdued whinging, most of it involving where do we go from here? What is the future? How do we make more money? It's very American of you. I'm proud of you. You know, and I know, that there are a variety of forces that are interacting here. There's a commodity. Many of you want to seek a premium, want to command a premium. The future lies in getting a premium. Not everybody all the time exclusively, but enough of you most of the time in most places. The premium is really the goal, because after all, a commodity wine is a race to the bottom. Everywhere in the world. We've all seen it. You all know the countries that have raced to the bottom. You can't afford to do it. You don't want to do it. One of the things in my torturing of the various producers I've seen in the last few days was that there was a sense of impatience, which of course is understandable. And I felt compelled to point out that in wine time, you only started last week. Really. You've caught lightning in the bottle in the last 40 years, the most preposterous, unpredictable success story in the history of modern wine, bar none. Not Napa. Napa had the advantage. Big country, Bay Area, huge money. How could you lose? Here you were, New Zealand, no one can find it on a map. Making a wine no one ever said they wanted. And you took the world by storm. It was incredible, really. If you really think about it, no one anywhere has ever achieved what you have achieved here, especially in Marlborough. None. Zero. Not in France, not in Italy, not in Chile, not in Germany, not in the United States of America, not in Australia, not in Hungary, not in Czechoslovakia, not in Slovenia. Need I go on? Can any of those countries point in the last 40 years to an international success story comparable to the one that's occurring here and has occurred here? And the answer is no. I'm in a position to know. Most of you are in a position to know. The answer is no. But you only started last week. So then the question becomes, where does the future lie? And I'll tell you where I think the future lies, and it lies in something that may strike you as a little odd as a concept, or a little different, but for what it's worth, I believe this to be absolutely true. The biggest challenge you have now is that there is no culture of Sauvignon Blanc anywhere in the world, ever. Think about it. There's a culture of Pinot Noir. Can anyone doubt it? Of course you can't. We all know there's a culture of Pinot Noir, and we know exactly where it comes from. There's a culture of Riesling, ditto. We all know there is one. We know exactly where it comes from. There's a culture of Cabernet Sauvignon. Again, we know. Even there's a culture of Sangiovese. It may not be worldwide, but we certainly know where it comes from, and we certainly know that it exists if anybody has been to, Tuscany, Umbria. But there is no culture of Sauvignon Blanc anywhere in the world, except now. If I've learned anything in coming to New Zealand as frequently as I have, and in coming to Marlborough in recent years repeatedly, is that there is finally a culture of Sauvignon Blanc that is emerging. It started, I'm arbitrarily choosing a time, 10 years ago. And it started here. This is the epicenter of Sauvignon Blanc culture, the beginning of a Sauvignon Blanc culture, right here in Marlborough. You have the scale, a prerequisite. You have to have scale. So what have you got? About 21,000 hectares of vines. You have to have capital. Obviously, you've got it. You have to have a distinction of place. Again, you've got it. And you have to have the ability to market. And again, obviously, you've got it. But what you do not have as a region is the advantage of having available to you a culture of Sauvignon Blanc. All of the Pinot Noir producers here in New Zealand, and in California, and in Australia, and in Oregon, have downloaded a culture of Pinot Noir that was simply handed to them. It was right there. Keep in mind, a culture of Sauvignon Blanc, or of Pinot Noir, or any other grape variety, is not just on the production side. It's also on the appreciation and understanding side. We tend to confuse the two terms, appreciation and understanding. They are different. Everyone appreciates La Tâche, not everybody understands it. Without a culture of Sauvignon Blanc, you cannot command a premium. When I was in Hungary some years ago, I had a long and slightly drunken dinner with a then young, very, very talented wine producer named Zoltán Demeter. And he makes exquisite wines, superb wines. And in the course of the evening, the usual crying occurs because that's what happens when you drink enough wine. And he said, "I'm really frustrated." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because I can't get people to pay what I have to get to make wines like this." And he said, "And I don't know why. I don't know why." And I said, "Well, Zoltán, I know why." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Because you can't go beyond your culture." They had lost a culture of Tokoi, which is where he was from. It got wiped out. First World War I, then World War II, the Depression, then the Communists, the Soviets, completely wiped out. So here was someone making an exquisite wine, or a series of exquisite wines, that deserved and needed to get a premium, but there was no one home at the other end. No one who understood it. No one who appreciated it. No one who was immersed in the culture, in his case, of Furment, which is the grape variety that he was working with, or is working with. One has to create a culture of Sauvignon Blanc. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking to yourself, but what about Sancerre? Well, forgive me. Let me tell you about Sancerre. There is no culture of Sauvignon Blanc in Sancerre. You've received no culture of Sauvignon Blanc from anybody, not in Bordeaux, where it has always been a commodity grape variety, certainly not in Italy, where it's been kicking around in Friuli for God knows how long, and certainly not in Sancerre. And you could say, well, how can that be? And the answer is really very simple. effectively, they didn't grow Sancerre. They didn't grow Sauvignon Blanc and Sancerre in any quantity until after phylloxera. What Sancerre they had was made sweet. It commanded a premium, by the way, but it was in very small quantities. The grape varieties of Sancerre, prior to phylloxera, which we're talking about the late 1800s, 1880, give or take, was Pinot Noir, Gamay, and the white grape Chasselas. So phylloxera comes along, everything dies. It turns out that Chasselas, they had a difficult time finding the right rootstock for that. It was early days for rootstocks, and Chasselas did not lend itself to the various American rupestris type, Labrusca rootstocks. So Chasselas went by the wayside. Pinot Noir was simply out of the running. It was too expensive to produce. There wasn't enough of a market. They couldn't get a premium because it was always an outlier. And so they turned to Sauvignon Blanc. And they made Sauvignon Blanc as a commodity wine. The idea was to put it in barrels and ship it to restaurants, bistros, and brasseries by train. It would arrive the next day in Paris. That was when Sauvignon Blanc began to be produced in Sancerre. What we have received today from Sancerre is not a culture of Sauvignon Blanc, because they never created one. Their vision of Sauvignon Blanc is essentially a Burgundian vision, which is why we get all of these little single vineyard wines from Sancerre. If you look at it historically, Sancerre was the westernmost point of the sphere of influence of Burgundy. After all, they were growing Pinot Noir. Think about it. When was the last time you ever heard one of those wonderful French stories about the monks and Sauvignon Blanc? Or the aristocracy and Sauvignon Blanc? Or the king and Sauvignon Blanc? They don't exist. There is no culture of Sauvignon Blanc. Now, for the first time, you are creating one. It started, I think, as I said, about 10 years ago. Conferences like this, all of the research that gets being done, the sharing of that research. When a culture of Sauvignon Blanc emerges, you will then be able to get a premium, and only then. Someone has to have, all of us have to have, a shared common vocabulary of appreciation and understanding of Sauvignon Blanc. Not just flavor descriptors, but also how Sauvignon Blanc gets made, how Sauvignon Blanc gets grown, what kinds of foods really pair with Sauvignon Blanc. Everything that we already know with other grape varieties. For example, if I said to you, well, we all know, Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir is best when it's blended. Now, all of us have really been the recipients of the culture of Pinot Noir given to us by the Burgundians, and we want to all recoil from that. We would say, no, that's not true. Pinot Noir is, only shows its greatness with site specificity. Well, the truth is the Burgundians have been blending Pinot Noir for 500 years. But the culture they gave to us, the culture that they created for themselves, basically said, no, Pinot Noir is exalted when it is site-specific. And we have accepted that, all of us, I'm the worst, absolutely, with no question in our minds that this is the truth. Well, we have no such truths for Sauvignon Blanc, not yet, but we need them. And we need them at the production end, and we need them at the consumer end, if you will. The world, in its collectivity, needs to understand what makes Sauvignon Blanc unique, desirable, essential, which leads me to another point. As I was going around talking to producers, everyone seems to be engaging, and I think quite correctly, here in Marlborough in finding ever great site specificity. What does this vineyard have to say? Is this vineyard, should it be delineated from that one? All kinds of exploration, which is absolutely essential. But I began to think, and I am honestly saying that I'm not sure that this is the answer or that I have an answer for this, but that it is something that perhaps we should consider. Collectively, we now live in a world where the Burgundian vision of greatness and of quality is ascendant. It wasn't always so. When I started writing 42 years ago, it was the Bordeaux vision. You never heard Cabernets ever described as having berry flavors. It was always things like green olives and pencil shavings and what. You don't hear that anymore. You hear now always about terroir, not about blending, always about site specificity, always essentially a Burgundian vision of the beauty of wine. And we are all, and it's certainly true here, the recipients of that. We have been saturated with this. We believe, most of us, in this. And now, here in Marlborough, I'm seeing this same Burgundian vision pursued. Fine. But is it really the right one? It began to occur to me that maybe really what should go on here, and maybe with Sauvignon Blanc everywhere, I don't know, should be a concept of Sauvignon Blanc that may be better served by a Champagne model. First, of course, as in Champagne, you do have to know all your vineyards. Believe me, they know all their vineyards. They've got them nailed. They even have quality rankings that go point by point from 80 to 100 for every one of their vineyards, thousands of vineyards. So they're not working blind. But they came to the conclusion, partly for commercial reasons to be certain, that the best Champagne is a blend of vineyards. I remember many, many years ago, decades ago, I had the privilege of tasting with a man named Edmond Maudière. And Monsieur Maudière was the chef de cave of Moet and Chandon. So what did he know? And he said to me, well, when we have these glasses of 100 different wines, he says, I'm sure it looks, very daunting to you. How can this be done? And he said, let me tell you something. He said, we're not tasting these things for the first time. He said, we make a blend, and of course we have an idea of what we want the blend to be, naturally. But he said, we know that number 32 is always what you use when you want a little more nose, a little more lift in the nose. And then number 72 is what if the finish is too short, you use that vineyard. He said, so we're not flying blind. We already know what each of these vineyards can do and not do. And as I was tasting around, and all of these wines were very generously presented to me, and they were coming from this location and that location and another location. And I kept finding that the wines that I really liked the most is what I would call, in Italian, Marlborough Classico. That it was really 10 vineyards that had been blended, and everybody would say, well, this is our entry-level wine. This is our, our basic wine. And I kept coming back, not every time, but often, saying, that was really the best one. That was actually the one that had the most. It was the most complete. And it's something to think about. I'm not saying it's absolute. As in Champagne, I like to think that you will have a relative handful of vineyards that are complete in themselves. And there are, as we all know, some very great Champagnes that are indeed single vineyard. But many, many great Champagnes, even most, are actually blends of multiple vineyards. The grower Champagnes are wonderful, and they can often be extremely rewarding, but very often they're quite idiosyncratic. They're not complete. And by the way, I will tell you something else that Monsieur Maudière said, which I'm not sure it applies to Sauvignon Blanc, but it was a great lesson for me, and I'd like to pass it on. When I asked him about blending, he had said to me, there's something that you need to understand about making sparkling wine. He said, bubbles magnify. And so he said, as a result, any flaw that exists in the base wine will be magnified when it undergoes the second fermentation. And he said, so you have to be very careful. And he says, I know when we do this, it looks like we're all being terribly scientific and all of that. And he says, of course, we have to come out with measurements so it can be scaled up. But he said, let me tell you how I really blend. He said, when I make a blend, I have in my mind the notion of a perfect sphere. He said, of course, that a perfect sphere is only theoretical. It does not exist. He said, but if you have a perfect sphere, no matter how thin the walls of the sphere, it can descend to any depth in the ocean without breaking, because the pressure is equal on all sides at all times. And he said, and when I blend, I try to create, I have this metaphor in my mind, I try to create a blend that is as close to a perfect sphere as I could possibly achieve. And I never forgot this lesson, because now when I taste wines, and whatever wine, it doesn't matter what the grape variety is or where, and I think, well, is this a great wine, or is it potentially a great wine? And I ask myself the question, well, how close does it get to being a perfect sphere? It's obviously a metaphor for harmoniousness, harmony. But I think it actually may very well apply here in Marlborough as well. That when you only started last week, so let's say 3 weeks from now, you've now identified all of the various zones and all of the vineyard distinctions within each of these zones. And you've got them down, just like they do in Champagne. You could have 100 of them, and you know exactly that this one has citrus, and that one gives guava, and this one does the hokey pokey. Who the hell knows what it is? But you'll know it. You'll know it all. And then, maybe, just maybe, the answer is not the sacred Burgundian answer, which, of course, is the church I worship in. But nevertheless, the answer may be the perfect sphere. And the perfect sphere may be, in fact, the blend. And that, in turn, may be the vehicle by which a culture of Sauvignon Blanc, created here by you, with all of your research, with conferences like this, with the kind of hospitality, in every sense of that phrase, that you, I wouldn't say exclusively deliver, but you certainly deliver it with a full heart. When there's a culture of Sauvignon Blanc, you won't have any problem commanding a premium. Everyone will be singing from the same hymn book on both sides of the church aisle, the producers and the people who are paying the money. That, I believe, is really the future of Sauvignon Blanc. Everything else is really just a technicality. With that, I thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.